Welcome to episode 11 in series 1 on the journey to conscious healthcare, where we explore what it takes to consciously create longevity, happiness and fulfillment in your life and that of others. The journey to conscious healthcare looks at the healthcare industry, disability sector, and how to best navigate these areas to get the best for you and your life. This series is called The Do's and Don'ts of Support Coordination, where we take a look inside of what it's like to be an NDIS support coordinator and help them navigate this ever-changing NDIS system. I'm your host, Trevor Keane, and I'm also the founder and CEO of Conscious Healthcare SA, an expert company that is known for high-quality healthcare services and transforming the healthcare industry in the disability space. Today's show is sponsored by Conscious Healthcare SA. At Conscious Healthcare SA, we provide high-quality NDIS healthcare services in the comfort of your own home. If you're interested in an easy and reliable way to navigate the NDIS and access healthcare services, please do get in touch. So today's guest, as we sort of jump through, is Olivia Watson. She is Adelaide-based social worker and also has been the leader for over a decade of social work experience across education, hospital and also community settings. With significant experience in the disability sector, Olivia has expertise in the NDIS space and has led a large team of social workers and support coordinators within a leading disability service provider in Adelaide. Olivia holds the AASW Disability Accreditation, recognising her expertise in this space. She has provided social work and support coordination in the NDIS context since the scheme rolled out back in 2013. Since January 22, Olivia has worked privately through her new business called Inclusive Social Work, providing clinical supervision, consultancy and training, and NDIS specialist support coordination. Olivia has a keen interest in supporting and mentoring fellow social workers, support coordinators, and allied health professionals through quality clinical supervision, supporting professionals to develop and also work on reflective practice and clinical skills. Olivia currently works part-time as a school student counsellor across both primary and also high school settings. Olivia Watson, welcome and thanks for joining us from Inclusive Social Work.
Thanks, Trevor. It's great to chat to you today.
Oh, perfect. Well, we always start with a bit of a personal question, and I think yours might be a bit of a quirky or strange habit or hobby that you've got. Would you like to tell us a bit more?
Yeah, sure. I don't know how quirky it is, but I guess one of my main hobbies when I'm not working is music. So I'm a musician. I have always played music my whole life, mostly just for fun, nothing too serious. But yeah, I play guitar and sing and I write songs. I used to do gigs, but not so much these days. And I actually also play the violin. I grew up learning violin all through school from a family of musicians. Mum's a music teacher, so it sort of seemed fitting that I was probably singing from the minute I was able to. And I guess the quirky part of it is I do have a bit of a reputation in my group of friends with a few other friends for writing songs and ditties for people's significant birthdays, weddings, that sort of thing. So that's become a bit of a trend in our group to keep that going. So yeah, a bit of pressure on us now to come up with something every time.
Absolutely. I bet you they're getting better and better.
Hope so. I'm not sure.
I suppose the other thing as well is as a social worker as well, if we jump straight into it, do you get to use your music in that sort of space as well, or has that sort of stayed separate?
Look, yeah, I'd love to more. There have definitely been times I've used music, in sessions with kids. So, whether that's bringing a ukulele in and just using it to engage a child, more so children than with adults. But no, to be honest, it's mostly limited to, children's parties and, being musical entertainment for friends.
No, it's all good. Not a worry.
But I would say, I just want to acknowledge, music therapy is a whole area in itself, a specialised skill and whole qualification that I don't have, and so I wouldn't want to proclaim to be a music therapist of any kind.
I totally understand that. Well, I reckon maybe we'll start at the start, if that's okay, as far as what inspired you to become a social
Sure.
worker. You could have been anything in the world, but social
Mm.
work is what took your fancy. What inspired that journey?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. So it was a bit of a journey. It wasn't something I realized sort of straight away or when I was, finishing school. I actually had a previous career as a journalist. So I studied journalism out of high school, got my first job working as a newspaper reporter at the Messenger in Adelaide for a couple of years. And I love that. And I think I was drawn to it because it's about telling stories. It's about, listening to people, advocating, sharing their stories, writing, communicating, all those things, which actually align quite well with social work when you think about it. But, I was very young, early 20s, really stressed out with deadlines. And I thought, I don't know if this is for me. So I went off traveling, did a year away, lived in England. Very long story short, I ended up doing some traveling in India and did a bit of volunteering work, which I now would just want to acknowledge I recognize was probably volunteerism, because going to a developing country and as a white privileged Australian and doing a week of teaching English in an area can be problematic. Having said that, it was a really positive experience, and I met some amazing people in this centre for young boys who'd been rescued out of bonded labour, and they had lots of tourists and volunteers come through and teach English, and I was able to do that, and it was more of a learning opportunity for me than anyone else. And the guy running that, a local guy from Kerala in India, was a social worker, and he ran this whole centre. And we got chatting and I thought, wow, social work just sounds like a great career. I'd never really considered it. And I was about 24 at the time, I think. So I came back to Australia, thought about it, and sort of serendipitously, the universe kept aligning and I kept meeting social workers, and I thought, maybe this is the job for me. And I looked into it and I realized the values of social work absolutely aligned with me and my life, values of social justice, equity, respect, empowerment, advocacy, all these things made sense to me. And I love working with people. I love supporting people. And so I enrolled at Flinders Uni. I did a Master of Social Work and graduated in 2011. And so I've been social working ever since.
Well, it's a fantastic story. And I tell her, being able to do journalism and put the right words in the right order, especially given that you're now in the NDIS and have been for quite a long time, it is really about how you actually paint the picture and write the stories, and not as far as how funding goes. And I think that those skills maybe have been pretty well utilised, would you say?
I'd say absolutely. I think some people think when you first say journalism to social work, see it as quite a very different career. But like I said earlier, there's lots of transferable skills, and certainly being able to communicate well, being able to, listen actively and then articulate things in really clear ways to get messages to the right people in the right way is super important. And obviously, as we know, working in the NDIS space, you really do need to have the skill of communicating, advocating, using the right language, and knowing how to get the message that you need to get across in a succinct way as well a lot of the time.
Well, absolutely. I think it's something that you've gotten in connection as well with Ifa Sabor, one of your previous colleagues at Novita, as far as about how to, she's come from a lawyer background, you've got a journalism background, but it's been amazing how people that have come from different backgrounds and perspectives have really then value added to the profession. I don't think that it's ever been a negative thing, really. I find that your journalism background would probably help you in many regards.
Absolutely.
Yeah, well, so
also working to deadlines. That's a helpful skill.
Well, absolutely. Well, I suppose while we're sort of talking about that, I know we've got with the professionalisation, actually, I'll go through it a little bit more. So the Social Work Registration Act in SA sort of recently come through. I'm quite curious as far as on a broader context, and I know you've sort of had a bit of involvement, I think, in that space. You want to tell me a little bit more about that and what that might well mean?
Yeah, definitely. Look, registration of the social work profession is something I'm hugely passionate about. And I guess for context, if people aren't familiar, in Australia, social work is not a registered profession as yet in the way that other allied health professions are, like physiotherapy, for example. I know your background's physio. And so the challenge for decades with social work has been how to give it as a profession the value, the validity that it really deserves. Because as an unregistered profession, anyone can call themselves a social worker. I mean, you need to have a social work degree to be a social worker, but you essentially there's no regulatory body that requires you to be, regularly having training, access to good PD and supervision, accountability processes and that sort of thing outside of your workplace. And so the AASW, which is the Australian Association of Social Work, of which I'm an accredited member, and I'm really passionate about, social workers being part of that. They've worked really hard to advocate in South Australia to get this registration process underway. And just last year, the Social Workers Registration Bill was passed through Parliament, and so there is an act in place that essentially introduces a process by which social workers would have to be registered. And that's really about keeping social workers accountable, about ensuring best practice standards are met, making sure that, we're doing the best job we can to support the people we work with who are often marginalised, vulnerable folks that have, a lot of needs and should be working with people that are fully trained, fully skilled and equipped to do the best job. And so at this stage, I guess the AASW is continuing to do work in the space of advocacy around that. And as far as I understand, I'm not, to be honest, I'm a bit out of the loop of where things are at right now, but sort of last I heard, it's still, to be confirmed how this will essentially be rolled out, what it's going to actually look like in implementation of the Act. And I think, I'm sure people are aware of, some of the really tragic cases, particularly here in South Australia, of people who have died, where social workers and other professionals have perhaps been, somewhat, I don't want to use the word liable or responsible, but, have had some role to play in that. And there's been questions asked about, their role. And I think it's just super important to protect people who are vulnerable in every way we can. I think one of the things that's going to be tricky about the registration process, from my point of view, is that it's only in South Australia, and obviously we need a national approach to this if we're working within a national disability insurance scheme. And it's all well and good to have South Australian social workers registered, but I'd love to see it consistently across the boards, in all jurisdictions and states. But where it's a state by state, if it's a state legislation, it's hard to I'm not like a legislation politics guru, so I won't say too much because I might say the wrong thing. But yeah, I think it's important that there's more of a widespread understanding of that. And I think when it comes to the NDIS space, one of the big challenges, and I've worked, as you said, I've worked in NDIS since 2013 when it rolled out. Where I worked, I was previously at Novita, which is a large disability services organisation in SA. And we as social workers previously worked in a model under block funding, under state government. We didn't have to think about, limited hours and billable time. We just provided a service based on the need for the individual clients and their families, which allowed us to respond to crisis, to provide that complex case coordination as needed. And so I think with the introduction of NDIS, the challenge for social workers was kind of figuring out our role and how we fit into a billable environment, and where the work we do is much less predictable than perhaps a physio or an OT who might have more of a regular block of sessions booked in with a client over a period of time that you can then evaluate and review. Whereas we sometimes get involved at the pointy end, we respond, we do a chunk of work, and we may not actually be involved ongoing, or we may not be needed for a while. And so I think in terms of, coming back to that NDIS issue of social work, is trying to understand how social work can be valued by the NDIS, how it can be better understood what we do. And I think being a registered profession is a good way to help that.
Well, absolutely. I think you put a case very, very well forward, and I think I'd love to hear more from Patricia. And I think the President, Vittorio, I'm sure will have a bit of an update in regards to from the AASW. I think whilst we're sort of talking about where things are sort of going, it's really interesting to note that the AASW has done something very interesting, of which you are qualified in the AASW Disability Accreditation. I'd love you to maybe expand upon that and tell me more about how it is and what it works.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So the ASW introduced a few different specific credentials or accreditations in the last couple of years. I think it was 2020, expanding on their existing mental health accreditation. So a lot of people are probably familiar with social workers having mental health accreditation. And that means those social workers can receive a Medicare provider number to work in mental health space privately. And then people can access the social workers with a mental health care plan the same way they might access a psychologist, for example. But for a long time, that was the only sort of specialized social work recognised through AASW. There's a whole process around mental health accreditation. But NDIS were introduced in a couple of years ago 4 new streams, one being disability accreditation, one being clinical social work, one being domestic violence or family violence social work, and the other is slipped my mind. I'll have to think about that and come back to it. But for me, having worked in the disability space for 8 years, I felt like it was something I really wanted to do, to have my skills, I suppose, and my expertise in this space recognised sort of officially or formally by the body that I'm a member of. And so, to be honest, I'm not really sure how many disability accredited social workers there are around. I'd love to hear from some if there are, but I was supported through Novita to do that. To get that accreditation. And basically it involved a lengthy application. Lot of time went into writing it, hours and hours. It was thousands of words, responding to some really specific criteria to demonstrate the work that I've done as a social worker in the disability space with people with disabilities, and providing really specific case examples of the kind of work I've done and how it meets, various criteria, I suppose. And then, as well as that, once that's sort of all approved, I then had to sit essentially like an exam, sort of a 3-hour exam responding to some case scenarios. And it was quite stressful. I hadn't had to do that since uni, so I was anxious, but I got it and did receive my accreditation. So that's now something I renew annually. And just make sure that to maintain it, I need to ensure I'm maintaining my ongoing continuing professional development requirements. So that's regular supervision, access to training and learning, and professional networking and that sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's fantastic that we've got a specific disability accreditation. I think if you look at, I'll use physio, I'll pick on physio maybe because it's the one that I'm involved in being a physiotherapist. Yeah. But like as in, you can go see a private physio, I won't mention any companies' names, but you can go see one of them and they might have no idea about, people with disability and all that sort of stuff. If you're cracking necks and backs in the private setting as such, you don't have that sort of understanding about, people that might have stroke or neurological sort of disability. So I think really having that specialty area and that recognition and also the requirement to continually train in that's fantastic, because you spoke about the block funding. The block funding, I think, in many ways used to be quite good in many sense because you knew that you'd have someone who knew what they were talking about when they were coming out. So because, fundamentally you could invest in the future and make sure that people actually ended up having skills in that area, where nowadays it's an open market, which is great in many respects. I'm all for freedom, choice and control. I think the challenge that we do face is we've got some providers that are providing services where I would say, with all due respect, they might be a little bit out of their scope or maybe aren't operating and providing as good a service as they could. I'm not saying that's across the board. There's definitely some amazing providers out there, but I think you raised some valid points about the importance of ensuring that we do have quality and upskilling and also accountability. I think you raised a really good point there.
And I absolutely agree, Trevor, that in the NDIS space, it's... Oh, sorry, no, you go.
Absolutely, back over to you. It's all right.
Just the idea of the balance between the NDIS, requiring the benefit of it being allowing, people choice and control, and there's a lot more providers out there, and that's all well and good. But the balance of making sure that those providers are actually legitimate, they're providing good services, best practice standards, and they're being kept accountable. The regulatory processes around that that's where some gaps have arisen, and I think it's an ongoing challenge for the NDIS to ensure that auditing is done well, that organisations are doing the right thing, and that dodgy practice is called out, and and people are kept in check, I suppose. But yes, I would hope, and I do think that the majority of people working in this space are really great, well-intentioned people, and that's really positive.
Absolutely, and I think it was the last episode on the series that I did, and the educational series in regards to talking about how important it is that we do have people that have had experience and understand what they're talking about. For example, if you're a new grad physio OT, it doesn't matter what your health profession is. I think it's really important that you do actually get experience and you get training. I know you've got clinical placements. I know we did about 50 weeks of placement before we went out, but having that is really important. I think it leads pretty nicely into you're really big into supervision, as not just social work, but in regards to specialist support coordination or support coordination. I'd love to learn a bit more about that, because I know you do it in your business, but you've got very strong views, particularly about how it should be done in all professions, from what I understand.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'm sure most people that know me and have worked with me would know that I'm very passionate about, providing and for people receiving really quality, effective, and purposeful clinical supervision. And that's for both social workers, physios, or all allied health professionals, I think, really need to be having access to good supervision, and also support coordinators and specialist support coordinators. And I think a real challenge has been that support coordination in the NDIS has not been it's not a registered role. There's no clear or specific requirements to be a support coordinator. Essentially, anyone can say, I'm a support coordinator. I know a bit about the NDIS, or I even don't. There are some out there you think, how are you doing this? You don't know the NDIS Act, so you don't understand the basic principles. Do you really understand the reality of disability in people's lives, and all the complexities and systems and things that are needed to know? But anyway, I'll get off that rant. Back to supervision. I just think it's so important that, support coordinators are thinking about how they access supervision. And a lot of workplaces do provide it, but a lot of them don't. And if they do provide it, it's not necessarily done well. And when I say well, that means it's got to be frequent, it's got to be prioritized, it's got to be, a set amount of time. There's got to be clear supervision agreements in place, and expectations and goals. And I guess in terms of, what supervision is for me and what good supervision is, I think for me it's about a safe space for clinicians or workers to regularly reflect on their practice, and to think about how their values and their experiences intersect with their work, in a supportive environment facilitated by a skilled and experienced professional. That's really key. It's a facilitated process. It's not about a supervisor coming in and being the expert and telling them, you need to do this or you need to do that, here's the solution. It's about, adult learning principles. It's about facilitating a space or a conversation for a worker to reflect and think about what they're feeling or what they've done and why they've done it, and perhaps how they might do things differently or the same, and why. So it's really about asking the why, not just the what and the how kind of questions. Of course, there's always space for solutions, and I think supervision is also really important when a person might be stuck in their work and not really sure what to do if the really complex cases come up or an issue has arisen or an ethical dilemma. Certainly, it's about seeking advice and it's about seeking guidance and information, and support. But it's really, from my perspective and the way I approach supervision, is very much about creating reflective space. And I must acknowledge, my supervision passion has really grown after attending a training a few years back run by Margaret Morrill, who I'll do a shout out to, who's an amazing trainer in the area of supervision, social worker. So her last name Morrill is spelled Morrell. She's a New Zealander social worker, but she's been in Australia. I think she might live in Australia. She does a lot of training here anyway. And she really inspired me to think about supervision in a new way and see it as actually really transformative experience when it's done well. It's not something that people should go to and just go, oh, I've got to go to my supervision now. What am I going to talk about? Actually about using it as a space where you can feel invigorated and refreshed and, encouraged and challenged, and come away from it feeling actually like, yes, I want to do my work. And I guess the other real benefit of supervision is that it's so important in part of maintaining our self-care. And people talk about self-care a lot as a buzzword, and I don't like thinking of it in terms of, just taking a bath with a candle and a wine, although that's lovely and I'm all for that. Self-care is about really recognizing, what we need, how to find balance in our whole life and our work, what our triggers are, recognizing our signs of burnout and our warning signs for burnout, so we can sort of stop and manage it before it gets too much. And I think supervision is a process that can help with self-care and help prevent burnout. And burnout is common. We all know that. We hear about it a lot, especially in this workforce, in the disability, in the NDIS space. People are burning out because they've got huge caseloads. They're not getting a lot of support. They're not getting supervision. they're not getting enough training, and that's just not going to be sustainable. And I want this kind of workforce to be sustainable.
Yeah, well, and I suppose if you look at the trend as far as we need a much larger workforce as well, it keeps getting talked about in politics, news, all that sort of stuff. But there's two things particularly that come out of what you just said there. One, I hear in regards to is you want feedback, and so the feedback helps you towards, there's a guy called Daniel Pink, which I mention quite regularly, but he's very big on autonomy, mastery, and also purpose. And so you obviously, for you to be able to master your craft as social worker, you need to be able to get feedback. And the other really important point I feel like you drag out there is also psychological safety. If you don't feel safe to actually look and reflect back and all that, how can you ever improve? So I think you raised some incredibly valid points there. And how do you sort of go about it? Obviously you do that in your business. Are you providing that quite regularly for others in the NDIS space?
Yeah. So, as you said, I've just recently started my business up. It's very new for me. So I'm doing I have a part-time role as a school counsellor, which I absolutely love. So something very different outside of the disability space, which I've done for a long time. And I'm really enjoying that. I love working with young people. I love, connecting with them, seeing them open up and be an affirming sort of positive voice in their life. So that's been really, really exciting for me. But I also love, having that's 3 days a week. So I've got a couple of days a week that I do my own thing. And a big part of that is clinical supervision. So at the moment, I've got a few on my list of social workers, and actually they're all social workers, but they also all do provide support coordination in different organisations and spaces. And I've actually had interest from a couple of support coordinators as well that have contacted me recently, which is really exciting. And a lot of them, I'm really amazed, are really seeking this out themselves. Like they're actually really proactively saying, I'm even willing to pay for this out of my own money because I really value it. Like I value training and professional development. And so at the moment, I'm doing that, flexibly, working around people's schedules. Most people sort of access supervision on generally sort of once a month for 60 minutes. Some people more frequently if they're wanting a bit more. It sort of depends on the individual. And I guess my whole focus, and I always say this when I start a supervision relationship, is you talk about psychological safety, but it's about that safe space and making sure that person feels safe with me, that they actually feel like they can connect with me. Doesn't mean we have to necessarily completely get along and be the same personality or anything. It's not about that. It's just about making space that people are going to be able to be open, honest. And I think safe space is actually about them feeling like they can come with their full authentic self, even if that means with their struggles, with their fears, with their maybe moments of, those embarrassing moments we all have where we think, oh, I said this thing to a client or I did this thing, I think it was the wrong thing. And so being able to feel like they can actually safely come and share, that's really important. You don't want a supervisor who's going to make you feel judged or shamed or, like you've done the wrong thing. And look, obviously supervisors have a role to play to keep workers accountable. There's an accountability element, and ethical challenges that might arise need to be addressed, absolutely. And that's done in a very clear way. And there's obviously a lot of sort of processes around confidentiality and supervision in the same way as how we work with our clients, that it is a confidential space. But if things are if there's risks or, duty of care issues or code of conduct issues, then yes, certainly things need to be addressed. But broadly speaking, it is a confidential, safe space for a person to just share in their successes and in their challenges. And my role as a supervisor is just to facilitate their growth and support them, provide them with information when they need it, help them explore their values and their reactions to their work, and let them kind of come to their own conclusions a lot of the time in a facilitated way. And so I could talk about supervision for hours. I won't, because I don't know if everyone else is as passionate about it as I am, but I just think it is so important in the work that we do.
Oh, that's fantastic. We will reference into the show notes as far as a bit more information about that and how you can get in touch if that is something that you want to pursue, because a lot of the audience is either specialist support coordinators or different allied health professionals, or even just people getting to know the NDIS. But let's flip it a little bit. So we're talking about giving supervision and all that, but there has been some mentors and some best bits of advice and people that you'd like to sort of mention. Do you want to mention a couple names and maybe how they've influenced you or what they've sort of done throughout your journey?
Sure. There's been a lot of people, I guess, through my years in the disability space in SA that have had an influence over me and in my work. And, I won't name all of them, but so many sort of therapists, particularly therapists that have been in the in this industry for decades that have so much knowledge and so much expertise, and pre-NDIS world, they just know so much, and they're so passionate about supporting people with disabilities and their families. But I guess someone that certainly comes to mind, and I'm sure this person gets named a lot, but that's Sam Payer from the growing space. I've had a lot to do with Sam, and I'm really have so much respect for the work she does, her passion and her, her voice, her advocacy, her lived experience with her family. I think, she's incredible, and the growing space is a really wonderful, provider of support coordination and also resource. They have amazing resources. So shout out there to Sam. I guess I'd also acknowledge, a lot of my Novita colleagues, but particularly my colleague Bonnie Hand, who's the clinical lead at Novita, who's actually in the role that I was previously in. And she's incredible. She's an incredible social worker who's got the same sort of passion as me for things like reflective practice and supervision and just, working with people in a really relational way and just connecting with them, and supporting staff to do the same. I also, I'm just sort of thinking here, like, I also want to acknowledge Jeremy Brown, who's been a really inspirational leader from my time at Novita. He's the Chief Operating Officer. So not actually from a therapy background, but he's done a lot of work in various client-facing roles over the years. And I think he's a great example of someone who leads, with integrity and in a really, I use the word relational a lot, but in a way that makes the people that he's, leading feel known and feel, supported. And I think for me, that's good leadership. Leadership, there are some leaders that are very task oriented and other leaders that are very relationally oriented. And you want someone that can kind of ideally merge the two. And that's sort of probably the gold standard. And I think he does that really well. So thought I'd acknowledge that too.
Oh, that's fantastic. You sound like you've certainly had quite a lot of guidance throughout there. Is there any one bit of advice or anything that you got along the way that's sort of stuck with you throughout?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing that's really struck me more recently as I've sort of really developed my career, taken more on, moved into a leadership role, because I was I was a clinical lead for the social work discipline at Novita for the last 4 years or so before I finished. This advice came from my manager, who's shout out to Josh Pryor. He's great. He's the manager of therapy services at Novita's Hindmarsh office, and he's a physio by background as well. And he just said to me one day when I was pretty stretched and at capacity and feeling a bit anxious about how I was going to kind of manage everything with all my clients, with my team, with my supervision, all the training I was doing and all the extra demands that come from left, right and centre. And he just said to me, and this is probably basic, but I needed to hear, he said, Liv, if you're going to take something on, that's all well and good, but whenever you say yes to something, what are you going to say no to? What is the thing that you're going to drop or shift? Because if you just keep saying yes to everything and you do it all, then you'll burn out. So that was really important advice. Sounds really simple, but it's easy to get really caught up in the grind. And same, and for support coordinators and social workers, we have a real inkling or instinct to just want to say yes to everyone and say, yeah, I'll take on that client. Oh, I really see the need here. They need someone. I'll do it. But if you stretch too thin, you can't actually provide a good service to anyone. You're better off knowing your limits and being really clear about that and making sure that you're in a workplace or a setting that allows you the space to set those boundaries, because if you don't, unfortunately, I just don't think it's going to be sustainable. So yeah, that's one thing. The other thing I think a lot about talking about working in the disability sector is just the importance of like listening to the voices of disabled folks. Actually, I don't have a lived experience of disability myself, and I acknowledge that, and I recognize, I carry a lot of privilege, and I think it's important to just be aware of that, and constantly be checking our privilege and checking in around, have I missed something here? Have I got a bit of a blind spot somewhere around a particular area, and how can I learn from the people I'm working with rather than make assumptions about their experience or maybe not taking on board what they're saying to me, and learning to really, really listen to people and take them at their word, even if that's hard. And it might be about, a little bit of supported decision making if we're really not sure if what they're saying is going to be in their best interest. But, really just listening to the voices of disabled folks, of all marginalised people, I'm super passionate. I haven't really got on this soapbox yet, but just while I'm here, I'm so passionate in general about, elevating the voices and platforms of marginalised people and people from minority groups. So whether that's disabled folks, queer people, people of colour, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think just, making sure, I'm passionate about that in all of society, of seeing, marginalised folks in, better represented in organisations, on boards, in leadership in organisations, hosting podcasts, running businesses, being on TV and working in the NDIS as well, leading these sort of spaces. And so that is a huge passion of mine. And I realise I've got on a soapbox, so we'll get back to the questions.
I think Dylan's done quite a good job with that, with his recent sort of becoming Australian of the Year and all that sort of stuff. It's been amazing watching him on his journey.
Yeah,
he was on a podcast or webinar only last week. Fantastic, just his words and how he sort of puts things together. I think he's extremely well spoken, and he's very much about, you talk about people having a voice. He doesn't say, look to me and I'll tell you what to do. He says, why don't you speak to the people, because you know best. If you've got a disability and you've got that experience, you know best, rather than actually telling people how to live their life. Because I think fundamentally, if we talk about models, that's where it was, right? It was literally, hey, you're in this situation, you do X, and now it's very much about what do you want to do, and sort of having that sort of open opportunity.
Of course.
Probably maybe never around.
And that's just, the social model of disability is so important. And I think I wanted to name that, understanding that the social model of disability is a recognition that it is society that disables people, not a person's disability, and that society actually needs to adapt. And that's not just talking about putting, ramps instead of stairs. That's obviously the most physical accessibility issue, but there's so many areas of access in so many different ways that need to be addressed. And I think, Dylan Alcott's incredible, and he's amazing. He has a really large voice and platform, and I really love following him and listening to his podcast. And I think I would encourage all people, especially if you don't have a disability, to actively seek out the voices of disabled people in your social media feed. So I'm really intentional on Instagram of making sure I really want to follow as many disabled advocates and activists and people as I can. And I mean, I can happily send you a list of people I follow maybe a bit later, because it's really great to just hear different experiences and diverse experiences.
Yeah, I think that'd be fantastic if you send through the list. We can chuck that in with the show notes, and also we can end up having other people further expand their knowledge and all that. So at the end of the day, that's what we're about. It's all about education. Whilst we are talking about education, I'm really curious, because you and I both have an understanding of the systems model, although I don't know whether the audience has an understanding of the systems model in regards to how social work can play a real big role, and how it can actually then have a look at, well, what are the systems and the things that are involved, which are actually preventing people from moving forward. We can spend all the money in the world we want on therapy, but if we haven't actually got the right foundations in place, then it's not going to work. I don't know if you'd like to elaborate on that or not, because I know Hayley Chenoweth was mentioning about that the other day as we're talking about where is social work scope and where should social work be playing.
Yeah, definitely. It's a big question. It's hard to sort of even summarize, but I think in social work, the way I think about social work is I said it earlier, we work at the pointy end of situations. We work alongside people who are experiencing, generally some kind of challenge or a need where they might want to see some change in their life, or some support to achieve a particular goal. And it's a really holistic. It's not just about their therapy needs or their, physical function. It might be about their access to their community. It's about looking holistically at the biopsychosocial model we talk about a lot in social work. Biopsychosocial meaning our biology, our bodies, psycho, our brains, our minds, our mental health, and social, our life, our world around us, the things that that give us meaning and fulfillment. And so as social workers, we have a biopsychosocial lens, and we look at people in a way that's I like to think much more holistic perhaps than others can. And so our role is quite broad, and it is hard to define in the NDIS space. And so we provide, therapeutic assessments, psychosocial assessments, and then interventions, depending on the goal and the need. And that might be a short-term block of sessions, but focused on a particular, goal, whether it's anxiety management or social skills, or it might be, crisis response if a person's experiencing, homelessness, and they need access to housing, but because of their disability, they're limited in access to mainstream services. And so trying to help them understand what's available to them and empower them to know what's out there, and not just doing these things for people. In terms of systems, I guess, systems theory really underpins social work as a discipline. It's the recognition that, there are various systems at play that intersect in our lives. And when you're a person with a disability, then often the reality is your life is intersecting with a lot more systems in different ways, because everywhere you go, everything you access, often there needs to be modifications or, additional services or supports in place. And in fact, I created a little graphic. I don't have it with me, unfortunately, but for my social work team a few years ago to demonstrate the complexity of the systems that we work within. And I thought I'll just start by coming up with a few I put disability in the middle and NDIS. And then around it, I was like, I'll put a few different systems, so I started with, housing, Centrelink, health, education, mental health, refugee services, justice system. Anyway, I started going, and I reckon I came up with like 25 or 30 just off the top of my head. And I realized that each of those systems is something that I, as a social worker, and people I'm working with have dealt with constantly in their life. And that means that we as social workers need to understand, firstly, that those systems exist and what they are, how they work, what their kind of processes are, legislation, like how to access them, what the referral pathways are, where the information is that we need, who we can talk to. And then we need to understand, I guess, the limits to funding. Unfortunately, funding becomes a big issue. And this is a big dilemma is, well, what does the NDIS fund? What is seen as the responsibility of the Disability Insurance Agency to support a person? And what is seen as perhaps another system issue, like an education responsibility, I should say, not issue, or a health responsibility. And what we find a lot that's a big, big challenge for social workers and support coordinators is where there's pushback, and one system is saying, oh, that's actually not our responsibility. Often it's the NDIS that might say, oh, that's that particular need that person has actually should be funded by, the health system. And then you're liaising with someone within the health system, say in a palliative care agency, who's saying, well, no, actually the NDIS should pay for that nursing care because that's, because of their disability. And you get this back and forth, and it's quite challenging. I've had this issue arise a lot, particularly the health versus disability angle, and it becomes really, really hard because I recognize that these individual systems that operate in silos have their limits and their purview and responsibilities. But when you've got a person with a disability in the middle who's saying, I just need to access this support to get through my day, and no one's going to fund it, well, then what do you do? And then the process of having to appeal decisions, go through review processes, seek advocacy support is so exhausting for people that often they just give up, or they just say, I'm just accept that I can't get that support and just struggle. So I really am passionate about, helping advocate or support people to understand what they actually can, what they do have the right to, and how they can sort of fight for that. But I acknowledge the system stuff is complex and it's exhausting, and it can take its toll on people.
No, I totally hear that. And I think I've got Aaron Byrne coming on, which I think I mentioned you in the pre-interview. And he's absolutely going to unpack a few different things as far as, what's in the support coordinator's box and what's health, what's disability, touching on AT, lots of different things, and highly encourage everyone or anyone that's interested in asking a question or getting something through to just send it through. I've got the information, which will be in the show notes if you've got any questions and all that. Let's change the tact a little bit. Let's get some smiles on faces. Why not? So have you got a good news story or something that you'd like to share? Let's get something to smile about, eh?
Yeah. Oh, there's so many good news stories. I think, a lot of the work we do, as much as there are challenges and frustrations, like there's constant, beautiful moments and connection. And I think for me, it's probably hard to pinpoint one good news story, but for me, it's always the relationship and the connection with people. Like, we are humans working with humans. That's what human services is. And, while we're professionals and we maintain those professional boundaries, we still have our own feelings and reactions to things. And I'm really passionate about like just being real about that and being my full authentic self. It doesn't mean I overstep boundaries or, share too much. I'm still a professional. I'm not a person's friend when I work with them. I get that. But for me, it's really those connections and having the beautiful privilege over so many years to have worked with people and their families for a long period of time. And I think, one thing that comes to mind is, I guess it's not really a good news story. It's actually a really sad story in many ways. But I worked with a family of a boy with complex, multiple disabilities over about 8 years while I was at Novita. In fact, when I started, he was one of the first clients I met. With a beautiful family I really got to know well, and I spent time in their home, regularly. They called me when they needed something or didn't quite understand something. They knew I was a safe person they could come to and access support. And this was a young boy that had a lot of health issues, and sadly he actually passed away. And last year it was obviously very tragic for the family and all the people that had worked with him. He was 16, and I just remember the most beautiful moment was when that family invited me into their home after he'd died, and the whole family was there. All the siblings and the in-laws, the little nephews and nieces, and the mum. And she just wept and she hugged me and she just didn't really even have any words. And I just knew that my presence was helpful. And that's not about making it about me. I'm mindful that I'm just another person they dealt with. But I knew that we'd had a relationship that was so, that was allowed to just really build over time. And I was supported, through NDIS funding to work with this family. And I knew that, it had an impact. And I think that's really key, is knowing that we can make a difference. And, obviously really sad for that family. And the NDI, it was interesting actually, because obviously this is another real challenge with the support coordination is we're funded by the NDIS to work with these people in this really intimate, vulnerable spaces. And then, if they pass away, suddenly we're just cut off from service. There's no more funding. And obviously organisations understand that, and you go out and you do a home visit and you don't worry about getting paid for it. But NDIS actually in this case recognised the need and actually allowed the plan to be extended for a couple of weeks, which they often do under the circumstances, for us to continue just working with the family, supporting them and sort of wrapping up anything that needed to be kind of finalised and coordinated. So that was really, a really positive thing from the NDIS.
Yeah, well, that's it's touched me a lot there, actually. That's very moving. And what I certainly didn't get out of that was that person wasn't a number. And I think that's my biggest pet peeve in regards to disability and seeing, being more than money is a big stand that I sort of have, making sure that people really get the service that they need and they get treated with dignity and respect. And I think you sound like you've done a fantastic job there. Moving to slightly different things before I get too emotional there. I'm really curious as far as they talk about getting the keys to the city. How about getting the keys to unlocking the support coordination box? What are the golden elements required for a good support coordinator?
Oh, wow. Good question. I wasn't expecting that. Probably a lot of what we've already touched on. I think the value stuff is key. Before we even talk about skills and knowledge and expertise, is the right values, which is, values of empathy, respect, justice, empowerment, genuine care for people, ethics, understanding ethical practice, professional boundaries, having the right intentions. And I think that's, once you've got that, and I think also then the ability to connect with people, the ability to build rapport and the ability to make people feel safe is absolutely crucial. And once you've got that, that's the fundamental, that's the foundation, I think. And of course, skills and knowledge can be developed. That's what training is for. That's what supervision is for. Certainly, support coordination is tricky because there's no required, qualification to do it. So essentially someone can come in with no experience. Now that's all well and good, but as long as they're getting the training and the supervision as they go. But certainly, a background in an understanding of disability, whether that's a background in social work or another profession or, disability qualification is obviously really helpful. But I also acknowledge the importance of lived experience too. There's some great support coordinators with lived experience that may not have a professional qualification who could do an incredible job. And I guess, skills of, we've talked a lot about, communication skills, being able to really articulate well, both verbally and in writing, what you're trying to achieve, and being able to really actively listen to people and really hear their voice and not project your own voice onto people. You're there to actually empower them to live their best life and for them to find meaning, not to assume what you think they should be doing, and then just to support them in that. So I think it's probably a particular personality type that does well in this space. What we do find though with that particular personality type, we always talk about it in our social work space, is we're all big empaths. We've got a lot of empathy, but sometimes empathy, becomes exhausting because you take on a lot. You're emotional sponges sometimes. And so, being able to manage your own experience, your own emotions, and know your limits is really important. So, yeah. And I guess obviously the things we've talked about, ongoing professional development, ongoing training, being up to speed with the latest developments in NDIS in terms of policy, legislation, practice standards, that's really important. So you've got to have the knowledge of that sort of stuff to be able to do the job well.
Oh, that's fantastic. You've summarised that very well. That's an ebook in itself, and I think Aaron Byrne might just literally cut that segment out and then just place that back in, and he's probably got his segment up for a couple of weeks' time. I think you've put that very well together. Whilst we're sort of talking about the whole self-care and a few different things, there's a few things you've alluded to in there, which are skills. How do you suggest that support coordinators handle the stresses and obstacles that are thrown their way? Because it is kind of a little bit like being a goalkeeper with your eyes closed, I think, at times, possibly.
Yeah. Look, I feel like I'm a broken record to harp on about the same thing, but supervision, key. Like making sure you've got someone you can talk to regularly about how to manage your workload. I think obviously day to day, just, being organised and prioritising and trying to understand what is realistic to achieve on a particular day, breaking down goals and plans, whether it's over a course of a week or, so just that ability to prioritise is key. And, ideally, if you're in a workplace that is supportive, then you hopefully have someone that you can go to on a day-to-day basis who may not be your clinical supervisor because you're only seeing them formally, once a month. You can go to talk through some of the challenges, or having a team around you that you can, debrief with and to work through. And like I said earlier, also knowing your limits and saying no when you need to say no. I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned in my professional career has been just learning it's okay to say no and being a real yes person. That was really hard for me, but I'm much more comfortable now with doing that. I'm much more comfortable with being assertive and saying what I need and being comfortable with that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I suppose with that as well, I'm curious as far as practically on the ground running, like, so what do you actually do for, say, self-care? We spoke a little bit about wine and baths and all that sort of fun jazz, but like, is it
definitely
meditation? Is meditation, getting involved in there? Or I'm really curious as far as practically on the ground running, what do you do with a stressful week or month even?
Yeah, sure. So to sound a bit cliche, I'm massively, big on exercise. I think it's so important that we, look after ourselves physically. And that might be, doesn't mean you have to be going to the gym and smashing out weights every single day, but whether it's just going for a walk each day, having a consistent routine and making the time for that. So I play a lot of sport, play basketball, play netball, I go to the gym, I go running. I love to be active, have dogs that I take, down the beach. I also, for me, and this is just me, I don't think, and I hope I will never have to work 9 to 5 Monday to Friday ever again because it just doesn't work for me. I know look, not everyone is afforded the luxury of that. And I acknowledge that I'm in a fortunate position where I can manage that at the moment. So I have a 3-day-a-week job and then my other days are very flexible. So I might take a couple of hours off in the morning to get some stuff done, to go to the beach, just to have a coffee and do some meditating, do some yoga, and then I'll smash out a lot of work and then work into the evening. Or, I might lock out a weekday evening to do some emails and reports rather than in the middle of a day on a Monday. So I just balance my week and I take, I'm really organized in how I want my weeks to look. That's helpful, making sure your calendar is really clear about what you're going to do in a particular day. So I guess those are the big things for self-care for me. music, just having hobbies that are creative and fun. I think everyone has a creative bone in their body. Some people think they're not creative, but we all are in some way. And just expressing yourself in different ways. And the other thing is just switching off from work. You know, it's really hard when you do run a business to switch off. I'm learning that quickly. But if you're not running your own business and you work for someone, you know, knowing when you clock off at 5 o'clock or 5:30 or whatever time it is, that's it. Don't check your emails. Get your emails off your phone. It's not helpful. You're not going to be able to do anything. And it also creates an expectation to clients and to people that and your colleagues that you're more available than you actually are. And then you do take on too much. So that's one of my really big takeaways and advice to people.
Oh, I think there's lots of gold nuggets that are hidden in there, or maybe not so much hidden. There's lots of gold in that, I reckon. It's come to that time. It's come to that time. Let's pretend that it's 20 years into the future, and we've now achieved success in the disability sector. What does it look like? What does it feel like? Paint me a picture.
Wow, gosh, that's a big question. I'm going to need some time. I mean, look, I would hope that the NDIS in 20 years is running smoothly, and a lot of the constant changes that have happened over the last 9 years are not happening anymore. That, you know, the issues have been ironed out, and when I say the issues, I mean there's a lot. I guess I want to see it be more accessible to people. I think at the moment, you know, access barriers are still huge. People being declined, you know, access for all sorts of reasons that just are loopholes, you know, bureaucratic loopholes. And I don't know what the answer is to that. You know, I probably need a bit more time to really think of the nuances. But look, yeah, that's sort of beyond me. But in an ideal world, you know, making it more accessible. I think creating more consistency in processes. Now, it's really hard when you've got such a huge system with so many staff, and you know, that's why they automate things. And sometimes it feels like you've got robots splurting out numbers to give you a plan because they're trying to make it consistent, but you actually need a human element as well. And humans are subjective. And so that's hard. I think the key is employing really good, skilled people into NDIS planner roles, into LAC roles, making sure that you've got the right people for the job, you know, screening them. So I'd love to see the workforce expand. I'd love to see more focus in, you know, in schools, in promoting disability as a place to, as an area to work in, you know, and the allied health professions growing. Like, you know, that I would say specifically on social work as well. I'm always really interested in social work students at universities. My experience has been that disability is an area that's less interest to people, and I don't know why this is. I know in my year of university, which is, you know, 10 years ago, more 12 years ago, no one talked about wanting to work in the disability sector. It was often, you know, child protection, mental health, schools. Not many people, and I don't know what that's about. I don't know if it's a lack of understanding, a lack of awareness, if people are too overwhelmed now by the NDIS. But having said that, when I've had quite a few students come through my previous workplace, Novita, and a lot of them have said, look, I'm happy to be here, but I didn't necessarily sort of know anything about disability. It's just kind of where I've ended up. Some of them have wanted to be there, but what they find is by the end, they absolutely love it. And so many people want to stay on and work, you know, get a job as a new grad. And that's really exciting. So I'm really passionate about, you know, developing and mentoring students and new graduates to really have a good experience in this space and actually enjoy it enough to want to stick around. I think the sustainability of the workforce is a challenge. So in 20 years, I don't know, I'd love to see people that have worked long term and actually managed to sustain it somehow without burning out. But yeah, those are just some thoughts. I'm sure there's a lot more I could think about, but I won't take all day.
I'll have to put a collection of everyone sort of taking that question together, because you get some very interesting answers along the way, that's for sure. We've been talking to Olivia Watson, an experienced and also dedicated social worker, now leading and growing her own team at Inclusive Social Work. Olivia, where can people go to learn a little bit more about what it is that you do?
Yeah, I do have a website, so it's www.inclusivesocialwork.com, which I've just recently set up, and I do have an Instagram page if people are on Instagram, which is just at Inclusive Social Work, where I generally just try to share, you know, information and advocacy stuff from particularly the voices of disabled people and marginalised people, rather than my own opinions on things. I'm on LinkedIn as well, Olivia Watson. Those are probably the main places to find me.
Oh, perfect. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Trevor.